Hello. Thanks everyone for coming. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so my name is Jasper Burns. I'm a graduate student in the English department here, and I've been asked to moderate this event, and part of the job of moderating it and helping to have a conversation is to give a short introduction about the Grand Piano Project, and I'll do that right now. So, the Grand Piano is subtitled An Experiment in Collective Autobiography. The term is wonderfully enigmatic, collective autobiography. But after thinking about it a little bit, I'm tempted to conclude that every autobiography is collective, whether it admits it or not. Even the most solipsistic and self-obsessed of chronicles, unless it describes a few decades spent in a cave, will tell the story of a collective, the story of a set of relations, a community, a family, a group of friends. So perhaps this is one of the many virtues of the Grand Piano. As an experiment in collective autobiography, it discloses the necessarily collective character of the autobiographical, the way in which we are only capable of telling our own stories as the stories of other people. It's always dangerous to make categorical claims about language poetry, or language writing if you prefer. Claims about what it is or what it isn't, what it was or what it wasn't. As anybody who has spent time with these writers, okay, sure. As anybody who has spent time with these writers, or even just read through a few volumes of the Grand Piano will know, these are figures who hang together not because they all subscribe to one idea of poetry or writing, but because they share some ideas with some of their fellows, and other ideas with other of the fellows, and this serves to knot them together, even in difference or disagreement. Still, with that qualifier, I'd suggest that one of the clearest achievements of these writers is the way they write texts that always point at their social foundations. And that's a little bit clunky, but sorry, I couldn't do any better. And I'll explain. This is writing that insists over and over again that it emerges from a particular social milieu, a particular set of activities and practices, a particular form of life, not only with its own language, but its own cafes and bars and neighborhoods and collective memories. As Ted Pearson writes in Grand Piano 5, quote, "Far from being restricted to its formal stratagems, this spirit of innovation extended to the editing and design of publications, the emphasis on collaborative production and exchange, and the social address of the work. But if the printed word remained essential to developing a readership, the Grand Piano readings, the after parties at the Persian Alb Zam Zam room, and the talks that Bob inaugurated were equally essential to building and making visible a community of practice. In some of the most intriguing works to emerge from this milieu, sociality itself becomes the object or subject matter of these writing experiments. Autobiography seems to be undergoing something of a renaissance in experimental writing circles. One thinks not only of Jennifer Moxley's The Middle Room, but of Juliana Sparr's recent books, The Transformation in particular. I tend to think that this signals the final coming undone of some commonly held critical cliches about the self-expression, or poetic subjectivity. What was at stake we see in the interventions of many of these writers against the models of lyric subjectivity on offer in the poetry of the 1970s or 1980s was never a choice between self or non-self, but a choice between different kinds of selves, selves in and as others versus selves as containers for experience. I think of the weaving together of the 10 different writers in the Grand Piano, and if you haven't read it, there's a pretty elaborate kind of schema in which each writer sort of rotates through position in each of the 10 books. The weaving together of the different writers in the Grand Piano, each one rotating through different ordinal positions as something of a model for this kind of subjectivity and this kind of sociality, or at least that gets at the matter in structural terms. Another approach, however, might be to think about the role of gossip. Gossip not in the sense of a mechanism for antagonism and rivalry, though some of that surely exists too, but gossip in the sense of a series of commonly held secrets, a form of affectionate mutual curiosity, a kind of low-level chatter that serves to give a group of people a common effective orientation. Though there is a great diversity of mode in the Grand Piano, and more than enough of the theorization and argument we might expect, I don't think it's wrong to suggest that these pieces are largely concerned not with the mainline narrative of who, what, when, how, and why, but with minor tales, anecdotes, and incident, the trivial and the quotidian. This would be gossip in its affirmative sense, meaning the stories a community likes to tell itself about itself, stories that carry secreted within them certain values and attitudes. But I've gone on long enough and should let them take over from here. So I guess the rest of the program for the evening will involve you sort of asking questions about the work and them talking about it, and maybe some sort of less formal back and forth can emerge from there, and people can comment on the work, comment on things that they've heard. Who'd like to start?
We're going to do the performance first, Jasper.
Oh, okay. Oh, I guess I misunderstood. Okay, good. Do the performance. That's good.
Ask the real questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could we have those trees cleared out of the way, and the houses, volcanoes, empires? The natural panorama is false. The shadows it casts are so many.
The comfort zone itself may turn discomforting.
Given all that, let me start again. I find concentration difficult.
Portrayal of a fictive mood, inconclusive days, meandering companionship, and reprieve from consequential acts.
Sometimes I think that each of us has a few scattered spots of time stored. We try to match these up with other people's fragments.
As usual, we have many details but no overall picture. 1975, fall of Saigon.
May Day, 1975, while bands played on. Makeshift stages. History traduced a decade in its lore.
Now I see it's the text, obliged, as if against its will, to stand for the event of writing.
A writer is anyone who creates a written work, although the word usually designates those who write creatively or professionally.
And I do think of the 1970s as a period devoted to discovering our reasons.
If the future of written words can only be their readers, whom can my gaze seek if not you? I find concentration difficult.
Doing almost nothing in the presence of others.
The veiled authority of such sentences is soothing, like watching masterpiece theater.
San Francisco is feminine, the hills and fogs nestling against the bay. Patty Hearst captured.
Nothing doing is not doing nothing. This is a paragraph, not a parable, on an ethics of dissensus.
I startled and offended her by giving unsolicited and naive critiques of some new writing she'd let me see at my request.
The transmission of poetry is a passion unlike any other. In one version, transmission occurs from poet to poet in a patrilineal descent.
But even in that early publication, her first book, Jean's work was notable for its edgy, cryptic pessimism.
Given all that, we assume a privileged and impossible view. We see the actress in her compartment from outside the moving train. Autobiography.
Could sentences formed in the university on one side of the street make visible the faces serving time in the prison on the other?
We were winning somehow. Did we win? I have a photo of the cake. I don't remember how it tasted.
At Christmas time, snow on Mission Street. It is Christmas all year round at La Rondalla.
Meanwhile, Orpheus is sent to the miners, seeking satisfaction in a dry county where the radio doesn't work.
Even when this precipitates accidents I may abhor.
One is then offered the role of negative principle of construction, and group solidarity is reaffirmed in the act of exclusion.
Antonio Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will seems apropos.
The past is not hell, nor am I in it. Through its two-way mirror, I see myself wonder which way and where the one-way street I'm on will run.
mood blowing, object seeking.
I know I am. We are inhabited by voices, affects, words beyond our own.
Experimental methods can be applied to any situation. Term fractal coined by Mandel.
It is an odd thing, writes Oscar Wilde, but everyone who disappears is said to be seen at San Francisco.
Who knows? Everything might wish to have played a script, not unlike hearing things again.
The dislocation of the pronoun I from normative uses, its deployment as an autonomous agent to organize disjunct syntactic strings, liberates language.
Not this writing, but a more explicit activism that I feel compelled to carry through.
You didn't let me finish, Tom. Why are you like that? Like what, I think, and instantly wake up?
The microcomputer in kit form had reached the U.S. home market, and the Russian Soyuz and U.S. Apollo spacecraft had rendezvoused in space.
How much of what you've said to me over the years do I really recall? I suspect the answer is very little.
1976, Apple formed by Jobs and Wozniak, last page of the industrial age.
Bar time tells the future. Perfect, progressive.
I went to UC Irvine in Orange County. There, I was presumed to be an expert on Ashbery. Poets were expected to isolate.
This was the entry point for malware, which crashed the firewall and set up a fake virus protection program that simulated a virus scan.
Then one's house, as one passes it on the school field trip bus, appears suddenly, objectified in cultural space.
Perhaps to achieve something in literature, one needs an idea of what it is and is for. Yet surely one needs no such idea to achieve something by writing.
Commingling of the living and the dead breaks apart the direction of a sentence. What happened?
Some physicists have said that all of time, past, present, and future, in some sense coexists.
1978, Jonestown. You order chicken soup with Hilton Obenzinger at La Victoria. Mosconian milk shot. Love is like moonlight on a dark sea.
Where hiatus mimes achieved form, the charade of radicality is rootless.
I would take a walk through to the grass of this peaceful extension.
A dream that urn burial was the end of a long work in which the urns were repositories of more than ashes, but once were dead and finished.
Society has its occasional declarative moments. Look at me, I'm your house.
Not a rhetorical question, I don't think, but existential. For what is it that happens when autobiography ends?
The Minotaur surfaced onto the streets in the clump of memory's glamorous boots.
I could say authenticity will have been about trying to overtake the past, inhabit it long enough to look around, say, oh.
1979, Dead Kennedys at the Death Club, 3 Mile Island. You have become each other's ideal audience.
But how tell these tourists from their spots? They could be anywhere and are.
I used to think the stand-in was somehow me in one of my anxious insinuations of compromised identity.
What I want here, and have attempted to write, is something like a parallel text that, in the end, would become indistinguishable from its primary source.
As a student commented during an October forum, as soon as you gain a leader, you lose a movement.
Let me start again. Let me show you things that vanish.
The politics of writing begins with the refusal to know one's place, except as a ground of contestation and critical intervention. While such refusal complicates the social spaces we inhabit, it also distinguishes language-centered writing from a resurgent poetics of presence. Our work and our works are equally beset by epistemological questions, questions regarding our capacity to resist as well as our complicity in the episteme we inhabit. and which led a community of practice to emerge from a nexus of private relations, a community whose members continue to address the problem of knowing their places. In a community of practice, there are different neighborhoods, some more accessible than others, whence it has been suggested that ours is a distinctly utopian project, which is not my sense of things. Even as we distinguish between utopia as a thought experiment and utopia as a social construct, there remains the fundamental utopian question that an ideal social order, but ideal for whom, is viable, sustainable, and desirable. A less sanguine view would recast these terms as absurd, coercive, and phantasmatic. The less polarizing term here would be hope, a concept which the scholastics saw as a movement of the appetite towards a future good, difficult to attain, but possible of attainment, and which Alain Badiou has defined as a simple imperative of continuation, a principle of tenacity, of obduracy, a principle we continue to embrace.
We chose a big old house in a neighborhood that had seen better days, Golden Hills. The homes there had been built around 1920, so Golden Hills wasn't Victorian, but it was pre-suburban. That meant it was more like San Francisco than most neighborhoods in San Diego. The resemblance didn't go far, though. We were right under the flight path, so the roar of jet engines was constant. Yet beneath that roar was a palpable silence. San Francisco had been a city of gestures, of codes, of stances. People and objects were in dialogue, whether directly or indirectly. At least that's how it seemed to a 20-something living in the Castro. San Diego, by contrast, seemed strangely illegible. The new strangeness of my hometown was stimulating in a way. I kept trying to think my way into or around it. Golden Hills was more than run down. I don't really have a word for what it was. Not exactly a ghetto. People said it was a neighborhood in transition. It was never clear what state it was transitioning to or from. I remember one night a stranger knocked. I went to the door but didn't see anyone. The knocking persisted. I cracked the door to look around, and a small man, a dwarf as it happened, tried to push his way in. I started pushing him back from the other side of the door, trying to close it. Picture this, a pregnant woman and a dwarf struggling on either side of a door, neither one saying a word. Well, maybe I yelled, "Chuck," surely I would have done that. We or I got the door locked and called the police. The police said, "Yeah, he does that, just ignore it." For me, this was more evidence that I was living in some kind of dream. I never put that incident in a poem, but I did write out of my sense of displacement and unreality. The silence that fell then, uninflected by email, seemed like a kind of siren song. I wanted to approach it.
I want then to say something more about community and about the art of thinking things through toward unfolding future understandings via introspection's inner speech, one's most intimate encounters with interiorized others. Out of debate comes perplexity, a crucial element in the game of ideas, which takes a lot of time to play and more than one player. One thinks in ways one has learned from others by standards more demanding than one could have imagined on one's own, and with information gleaned from outside sources. I listened to recordings of their music over and over and began to build a feel for defiance. I loved being a part of it. They say, just play. The result is the apotheosis of games, where all instructions and preconceptions fall away and trust and pure wakefulness preside. Writing provides a perfectly viable site for sequential and more rarely simultaneous alterities. One can cross-dress at one's desk. One can become a mule or a goose. Or maybe it's less an art than a necessity, an encounter forced on one by chance. One wants to grab one's chance. Kit in a backyard on Raymond Street with a guitar, or Ray moving toward a conversation, and Barry, who is in the passenger seat as we drive down Columbus Avenue. I'd taken a beating in the Q&A following my talk. They invited me to join them, and immediately one of them remarked that they had just been wondering if I had read Milton. Then isn't memory being posited implicitly here as a fundamental constituent element of consciousness? I was very much interested in the musical possibilities of suspense and resolution.
Then I wrote a scenario for a film in which my transvestite friend Marie-France would star. In one scene, she and her haute bourgeois psychoanalyst lover walk by a butcher stall in the old Central Market, and a drop of blood spatters onto her ankle above her high-heeled pump. She places her left hand on her lover's arm and, looking back over her shoulder, raises her foot behind her to dab at the blood with a handkerchief held between the extended fingers of her other hand. Her hands are large, adding to the fragility of the gesture, whose undefended dependency presages her death later in the film. But now, having wiped away the stain, she looks up, shakes her hair into place, and smiles at her lover. How well the desire to start over and over would turn out. I got up and walked toward the hall where I'd seen Miles' head a moment earlier. It was empty. Where was he? A door stood ajar at the end of the hall, and I felt the winter air on my face. The club was hot, and it was welcome. Stepping through the door, I found myself on a small landing with a cast iron railing. Miles was there, smoking a cigarette, a suede overcoat thrown over his shoulders. "Oh," I said, and made to retreat. "That's all right, man," he muttered in his inimitable gravel. I pulled a Camel from my shirt pocket and lit it. To my left, a fire escape zigzagged up the back of the building. Soon I was freezing, but I wasn't going anywhere. The night air was smoky, as it often was back then. Miles reached out and flipped his cigarette butt over the railing, then walked back into the club, nodding in my direction as he shrugged off the coat. I touched him on the shoulder and asked, "Will I see you again, Miles?" "That's a nice suit you're wearing," he replied. "Black. I'll know you by it in heaven." "But it's not going to fit me then. It's already a little tight." "That's all right, man," he repeated over his shoulder. Perhaps a hero is no more than someone free to act, but every page is a palimpsest and a battleground too, and marble, unable, is incised.
In George Perec's W, or Memory of Childhood, two texts alternate. One, an adolescent fantasy of a quasi-fascist state culture based on athletic competition. The other, a documentary investigation into the fragmentary evidence of Perec's childhood, a series of displacements occasioned by the Holocaust. In this book, Perec poses the dilemma of autobiography. All memory is suspect, being a construct of the present. Consistency, coherence, and narrative unity are attributes of the fantastic. The rigorous approach to the past limits itself to fragments. Memoir stretches between the twin poles of pure fiction and mute fact. I remember certain moments, the most embarrassing or tragic, the fateful, the triumphant, the tender. Also, occasional odd or random ones. A year or so after my graduation from elementary school, I went back for some reason and found myself walking through the empty hallway thinking about time. I decided to remember this moment for no other reason than as an experiment, like putting a bookmark in time. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute of Quantum Optics say that time may not exist at the most fundamental level of physical reality. What's more, the laws of physics don't explain why time always points to the future. All the laws, whether Newton's, Einstein's, or quantum mechanics, would work equally well if time ran backward. When his lifelong friend Michel Besso died, Einstein wrote, "Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." Counting in real time, whether by word, breath, or beat, anchors us in the present moment, while our mind drifts out over land, meeting our destiny through a series of problems to be solved, expanding to the ends of the earth. Nietzsche said that a tree is a new thing at every instant.
Would like to rest my eye. Let me move over. I'm going to the dance. Don't try to figure it out, honey. There's been a move on up, over and around. When I find myself for a long duration in a social and public world that seems entirely straight, I start to feel cramped or ezark. Dear San Francisco, this writing may be a symptom. If it's not also present, I miss heterosexual desire, mine and it in general. I'll take more of each. Did you know that I was publicly harangued in Detroit for being heteronormative? Next time, please read my book. But you're married, and that means no phallus and a Ford for you. In Detroit, it could happen that you'll be stamped as a Ford unless you make some declaration that nature would scoff at. Sometimes I dream my passport with a Ford insignia. Non-C posits that community entails exposure, facing outward, dialogue, and exposition. Thus, literature is necessary to community. Yet, as noted in my essay, Home in the Book of Daniel, communal resistance may involve going inside and reading up on the situation, thinking it through. I wish folks in Detroit were allotted more time and space for such undertakings, but global capital's designs are elsewhere. Exposition crosses diverse spaces. In writing, they can be crossed in an instant. Turning to your consideration of time and space, dear Ted, circa the 1970s, I was into guys, but dug anarchy and found an uncertain freedom in the gay scene, even as I was a guy during certain poker games. Gender switching didn't work when it came to discussions about Zukofsky. But what freedom really meant was freedom
I
from...
sort of felt I'd be more comfortable like this. I had felt kind of ratty all day. And Dorothy, do you feel comfortable? Steve, not right now, no. I felt pretty comfortable when I walked in. The pressure to participate on time in a situation hurtling forward on scarcely predictable telescoping of rhythms in various dimensions creates acute stress and challenges concentration. Each of us has our own sensitivities. I recognize an indefinite number of them. Each of us has our own incentives to quit, to go on. Everyone is speaking at once. How do I address my partners in how they have responded so differently to this shared challenge? The moment of truth was at hand. Strangers are becoming familiar. I don't know yet whether I feel safe with them. Whose skin is thinner at the moment? Bob, it's Steve's word, Barry says. Dorothy, why is it Steve's word? Barry, well, I just think it has Steve's name on it. Bob, you hear him saying it when you say it. The self was not worth holding on to, but I had set up responsibilities for it to enact. I had chosen to play the part of Steve Benson in an unscripted improvisation, and by this point, I had felt undone. I was no longer just myself, and increasingly I found out and lost who I might have thought I then was, or was to be. I think I meant to do this. I also knew this didn't happen. If comfortable was my word, what did that tell me about myself?
To this day, I spent an afternoon in bed with M in a brick building near Spadina Street in Toronto during a sweltering summer, intermittently watching the moon landing on TV. Having come to Canada to consider emigration from war and the draft, I had just met with an official of the Immigration Authority the previous day. The scenario I imagined would turn out to be literally nothing, a spatial and temporal disconnect. It did not require a conscious decision to reject it. I merely went on to the next thing, a return to Berkeley, and wait. That fall was a descent into free space, the space of having missed the train. I kept my student job and sent in my applications, for which Josephine Miles lent her support, and arrived at Iowa in the coldest January on record to begin the next semester. I had made a decision to become a poet as a response to what I would later call the politics of nothing. 20 years later, I was again charting intermedial space. Progress and Total Syntax had been out nearly 5 years. Their initial reception had been positive, but a reaction had set in. First, it was a series of hostile articles in Poetry Flash, generating so much attention that it spilled over into mainstream venues such as Partisan Review and the New Criterion. One, titled Escapees in Paradise, by a former surrealist poet in North Beach turned spokesperson for a neoconservative think tank, generated a righteous response in the name of poetry by Bernstein and Andrews as a letter to the editor. But red baiting was the real agenda here, based on the evidence of my infamous line from Progress, Stalin as a linguist. This meant, of course, that language writers had made common cause with Stalinism in some crypto-authoritarian scenario only Slavoj Žižek could explain. Given
The atmosphere.
The electricity
Often
is DC,
in the room was
translated
so
live.
radio won't
as
work,
An edgy mix
and there is no
of
hot water.
expectation.
in
He
a
repairs
curiosity
sprocket
or
holes
mission
while Pennebaker
and
reviews
resist.
rushes from his current project on David Bowie.
Anger, abandonment, despair, desire, loneliness, frustration, longing, surprise, competitiveness, emptiness, alienation.
In 1947,
Good
on a
idea.
white night with the vagabond Monsieur Chani, Emmanuel Levinas said to his remark, to the extent of all he knows, I cannot tell you. Everything I know,
the
he
comrades
knows.
July party
I was
with Alan
with
Bernheim
would help
and
in
Alex
the cause
Smith.
of
And the
identifying
dressed
the
for the
proper
occasion
mode
with
of
Alan
work I
all
should
in blue,
engage.
The uncertainty
Labor
of any
was the
idea.
imaginary.
I in red.
The imagination's
star of
ability to
surgery
perform
on the
feats of
Writing.
unlinkage then is an essential part of its subversive,
Writing.
liberatory
With some
potential
version
and
of
its
herself.
opposition.
Correcting proofs of many moments of error and vulnerability, and I experienced many at the time, so intense that I thought they could be literally fatal
Love
for
and
anyone
death.
who witnessed
An
them.
old story.
I can think of
Outside
several
the roar
people,
of
in
the
fact,
freeway,
who have
a
since
huge
died
line,
as a
a
result
line
of
of
having
love.
witnessed my error and vulnerability.
As one can look back and not fall forward, so one can love life without being happy. I, for example, could sit motionless forever and think about
Even though
your
it looks
past.
like
Slish
poetry.
Slash guy
Pigeons
was
and
Jim
doves
Jones.
sit on the wires
Iggy Pop.
outside. All are
I
dirty
remember a
gray,
softball
except
game
for the
between
one
language
white
poets
dove.
and punk
Either
poets.
I think the white
I remember
dove is the
17
soul,
Reasons Why.
or
In the 70s, any action made seemingly endless ripples in the ocean of theoretical time, and single words, fragmented phrases had this boundless potential too.
Climbing to the little-known
Instructive
elevated
practices
train, brickelaged
in
onto
everyday life
aqueducts left by the
ensure
Roman
that
founders of the
whatever
nearby
achieves
university,
form
I was shifted
will
through the
not
Berkeley hills on a
become
traceless
arrested
route.
totality.
I
destructive
don't mean to
envy.
overstate the
What
case.
writer doesn't know what that
I don't think
means?
the
moved his
steepness of
whole
my
Stendhal
learning
made a
curve in the
great
late
literature
90s
out of
Can be
destructive envy.
exaggerated.
Chinese
Though-
professor.
Happiness,
The ruptured tour
fear,
of my apartment
loss,
was
hope,
bracketed by my
curiosity,
two deadpan
repression,
recitations
effort,
from memory of
impossibility,
speeches by contemporary
distance,
Chinese
camaraderie.
peasants.
First time, second thoughts, third world, fourth down, fifth column, sixth grade, seventh heaven, 8th street, ninth inning, 10 directions, 11th hour, 12th day of Christmas, 19th nervous breakdown.
I live on that.
This-
The
said.
result was an adamant writing deployed within a microsystem of conflicting forces to generate conditions that would make any single explanatory narrative
Eyes of the
impossible.
mind are
advocated
proofs.
participation in the
Spinoza
global
said, "Through the
transformation
camera's
of
viewfinder,
world
I see a
war
world
as
equipped with sharp
accepting the
corners."
task of the working class.
Surprise,
To speak
Racing.
as a
The
dyad
picture
in which the
spreading
I and you
myself.
roles were
Desire.
handed back and
Spectral
forth.
What will happen
treadmill.
A game with implications
Vague
that
possibility,
became
I can't
increasingly
remember.
marginal,
serious.
disconnected,
Intelligence.
The moment
unfound.
we
A
capture
late
events of
night
our past
knock.
life in words,
No drama,
those scenes are lost
hardly an
forever,
epiphany,
replaced
simply
by
the
text
slow
we now
epiphenomenal
see
unfolding of
before us.
trauma long accrued. In the steady retardando of the daily grind, we find the effective correlative of the anomie
Does it
within.
mean World
Brick
War
buildings,
III
flickers
as the
of
Los
rain,
Angeles
windows
Times,
were hung like
24
white paintings on a
September
gallery wall.
1949,
Death
in an
steals our
article
past.
oscillating
Not
between
us.
For
alarm
precisely that
and
reason, I took 600 photographs of garage doors, barred windows, and gas meters from the lower half of San Francisco.
I thought of a memorial.
Hence there are objects
Mausoleum, mid-afternoon,
that capture
the sky
one's
is already losing light.
As the
I ate a
field that
Snickers
one's
bar for energy and thought about the
Continues
drive
to
ahead of me.
expand.
Get it right.
The train shifted noisily on its track. I turned to look through the window to where the landscape swept by in darkness.
To be a case-hardened, armored-piercing, depleted uranium-coated anti-tank missile set against the hardened positions that confront one.
I grew
This is simply
distrustful
an
as the
expression of
particular
resolute
picked up speed,
and sometimes
first honing
seemingly
in on,
pedestrian
then running a
efforts
smack
by those
into
who may never
history,
win, but are
evoked as a
determined
moral
never to
certainty,
lose.
or else
But what of those silences we call awkward,
Continues in the form of physical
embarrassed,
movements, light,
ominous,
darkness, and the dim common
pregnant,
ground of theater seating, which signifies
Or
our collective
companionable.
dream state.
Writing as they will read for the author leads me to fiction and evasion. The truth in that.
A list of feelings is not emotional. Combativeness is the sensation that goes along with cataloging feelings and emotion as well. Curiosity, what does one call the feeling of distance, self-confidence, distance?
According to Victor Shklovsky, in order to write about love, one must write about everything not about love.
Desire is that, whatever, wanting to be satisfied. And there is no desire without objectification. See a pigeon on a city street, court a crack in a sidewalk.
As one story leads to the next, plots and subplots hinging and depending from one another in an elaboration of imaginary relationships, events cascade across time until suddenly the man's hand jerks forward and knocks over a glass of wine, staining the white tablecloth.
You were reading Shklovsky. I was reading Bataille.
Did you think money grew on trees?
I think of history as a series of repetitions, each of which we nonetheless greet with surprise, convinced somehow in the face of the same thing over and over that something new has happened.
Benjamin wrote of the Jewish tradition that each moment may signify the arrival of the Messiah, so that history is shot through with chips of messianic time.
We cannot shed the light that has fallen on us.
I think back a quarter century, Tom, when a quarter was worth something. Well, not really. When the century was 20th, and upside down just looked like right side up to us.
Literature is like a great sailing ship. We writers imagine ourselves manning her sails or as the wind that fills them, but we are the waves she cuts across and no more.
And who, just exactly, is speaking?
Fact is fractal. There is no such movement as language poetry.
Nancy posits that community entails exposure facing outward, dialogue and exposition. Thus, literature is necessary to community.
The only sort of daring I'd ever heard attributed to a female was sexual daring, and this was more or less tantamount to disgrace.
A habitation designed with low productivity in mind. This is what she's chosen after the world has fallen apart.
My parents are calling me out of my room because Lucy is about to come on. It's silly the way she wants to do what Desi does, the way she wants to go too.
Punctuating this desultory excursion are moments when Jean Moreau springs to life.
The song remains the same, so we're told. There's a very attractive guitar solo. Been there, done that, we will soon say.
Saw a decrease of sunlight west where I already was, and an increase in drought and flooding.
Is the speaker, writer, a sailor at risk, or a mermaid leading him into danger? Both, of course, gender trouble.
Dear negativity, how many words you've spared me.
To be a radical, an extremist, was to attack, to gain purchase on our common condition.
The problem of other minds asks what makes it possible for us to conceive of mental states other than our own.
Who are the designated others, the ones we want to be with? And then, who are the others?
Perhaps a cultural formation is as a gathering of clouds, which, when sufficient density is achieved, precipitate in previously unpredicted ways.
Strands of culture appear in relief through gaps that foreground the mechanics of transmission. How does one comprehend the necessity of where one is?
I have suggested that music is not a language, nor does it mark where language ends, but rather where language and poetry begin.
If there is an analogy to music, it is not to duration or flow or synesthesia or expression, but to an experience of the incompleteness of one's knowledge.
On the other hand is the anticipation, at once eager and apprehensive, of movement toward the elsewhere that will be, and then will have become, what's next.
We may not understand what it was that drew us together, for instance, or we may supply a complete bibliography of endlessly unfolding desire based on our experience of incompleteness.
Steve, your attention, freed of the task of remembering, can cast about for other things.
It was hard to stop without a plan for the result.
The phrase willfully fraught with social consciousness needs some unpacking.
I kept an untitled journal that indicates that I was preoccupied by thoughts about what I wanted in intimacy and my uncertainty about it all.
Is it in terms of conscience? That's what I said, that one acts in private life?
The narcissism kept getting recycled by the social.
A 10-pound bag of potatoes was selling for 58 cents at Safeway, and filet mignon was $3.69 a pound.
So I stayed home and ate steamed potatoes and beans and leek soup and watched the CIA movie on TV.
I was interested in the social and socializing force of language and the structuring force of memory.
How quizzically and with what amusement I regarded what words say they aid us in knowing.
And involuting diasporic turmoil, and a culture that is full of energy, boisterous even, but whose introspective practices spin around a love-hate relationship with its own alterity.
This seems to have been a terrific release of ease. However, an allowance of appreciation for myself as is.
Allowing for a certain resolve?
But I had to think about it, Lyn.
The anti-representational aspect of the work,
I question the necessary.
pop totemic plein air impressionism,
I don't know why.
is the writer's making apparent.
Out of respect, care.
A mental, not actual world.
I don't know if I answered your question.
In these times of surveillance, insanity, and landscape death,
One can't represent life itself,
if we slide from the space of labor to a polyground of activity,
as if we were all riding a rapids of our mutual construction.
are symptoms of not having
My favorite shirt and my small notebook.
everyday life
Living, breathing, and vocalizing, the text would be betrayed.
sustained by stolen, unremunerated time.
And safety for many, many people.
History presented her with newspaper clippings about the prison industrial complex and state executions in Texas.
Open questions concerning the ability to respond.
The material conditions are the work's memory.
Emerging through this netting of words.
The past is the charge in the nervous system of right now.
I thought I could do this if
There is no transcendental perspective,
the form and content of our joint experience.
but rather exaggeration, alteration, diminishment, shifts of scale.
We all have different idea of those words too.
In 2010, the university is not free, it's expensive.
In talking action, present a circumstance.
Oh, it's possible to have a lot of confidence, even to be effective in the world without much sense of purpose.
Those are the things we can work with, seeing them as precisely that, what one has to work with.
Political thought interrupts other thinking.
Imagination is turned to the present. It is the present moment that wants expanding.
In Fred Hampton's apartment, the walls were marked with hundreds of bullet holes. We walked on boards the Panthers had laid across puddles of blood.
The stiff, geometric youngster of suicide seems to have bartered away something in exchange for the beauty of heroism.
Each of us knows the answer in advance. To think is to be an ideologist.
One imagines one has somehow been misled, taken, or gotten lost.
Taxonomy is simple and transparent, showing itself only to reward your attention.
The epic is monumental. The saga is long, a testimony to powerlessness.
The older I get, I need to lean in close to read the writing on the wall.
A gust is already blowing aside the curtain over the bed.
Because this is how I understand the phrase, the person who makes, who arises in the identification as a source of attraction, an occasion for desire, someone to love.
But the characters include Vice President Boynton, who kicks chairs when he gets mad and hopes to do a swan dive into your conscience.
Famously, after a symphonic work ends, the hall reverberates with silence. Then there is applause.
And then she told her mother, "Mother, take him home and make him rest."
Rhythmic changes, transport time, emblems of desire. The lyric is less a genre than a way of organizing language.
My poems respond to happenstance. Whatever happens by within a certain time frame can enter them, so they are penetrable, interrupted, and yet...
As a poet, there's no limit to what I cannot do. Hence, possibility inheres in its negation, the motto of my career.
Hey, watch me say, hi, fishy, someone shouts. I was writing at Rubio's, a fish taco joint.
In Ovid's version, the sirens are calling to their lost playmate Persephone. Thus, they are desiring subjects, whose songs address the object of desire, and whose silence underscores its absence.
It gestures towards what's left out. It participates in a dialogue with the unspoken. It deals with the mysterious boundary between inside and out.
So perhaps our mother tongue is what Hélène Cixous has called the language women speak when no one is around to correct them.
Which is a feedback loop of sonic resonances, echoes, familiarities. Clearly, it will be fragile, doubtful. That is part of its appeal.
On 8 December 2009, I posted one word to my Facebook status update: iconoclasm.
Music teachers often tell their students the right note out of time is far worse than the wrong note in time.
In Dordogne, I met the partner of a French resistance fighter in her 80s, living at the Buddhist retreat. She asked about my writing. Didn't Tristan Tzara do all that around 1916?
Every software program can be reduced to a text, a compilation of code lines, which themselves are nothing more than a series of zeros and ones.
Specifics. In 1977, I published Decay. In 1980, 1 to 10. This press brought out Ron's Ketchak in 1978.
In 1974, critical reception was the furthest thing from my mind.
The Russians have a name for the epoch they were living through at about the same time, the era of stagnation. Stagnatia. You could put it in a bottle and sell it, like a kind of vodka.
Mission Street was my Second Avenue, a phantasmagoria of 20th century mercantilismo.
On 1 May 1975, I attended a public meeting of a communist organization. The fall of Saigon, of course, did not simply coincide with that date.
The Vietnam War bequeathed to Silicon Valley a boatload of radical characteristics: the sense of continuous emergency, the sense of no higher authority, the dependence on improvisation, the endless hours of engagement, the exhaustion and fatigue, the intensely combative mentality, the sacrifice, the camaraderie.
In the 1980s, characterizations of the language project encouraged people to negate it. But we were undertaking it for love. Love? Yes. I was coming face to face with obsessing disunity and suffering repeated dishevelment. I hear the title of Robert Creeley's For Love echoing back as from the face of an insurmountable cliff. What there was to be a part of was difficulty, exercising the power of disturbance, turning love out into lateness and newness next to each other by virtue of what Adorno calls an inexorable clamp that holds together what no less powerfully strives to break apart. An inexorable clamp? Love? Oh, glad to see, oh, glad to be, where company is so derived from sticks and stones, bottles and bones.
After teaching at the universities of Chicago and Illinois through most of my 20s, I left the academy in an attempt to ditch my own schemata. I wasn't looking for any new ones. Hence, it was part of the disequilibrious relationship I had with you to disbelieve what you believed. Yet, driving down Cole Street to a reading, I heard Bob say, "Get thee behind me," terminology. He was so extraordinarily, infuriatingly, new-mintedly brilliant. Still another time, he attempted to convey Saussure's distinction between speech and language with so evident a lack of comprehension that I moved behind a pillar in the loft and rolled my eyes. Against the reality of speech, an abstract entity would be posed as language. Is that what I'm doing here? Ah, Marie France. I think she must be dead by now. In her lightly accented North African French, she asks him, "Will you help me find a hotel?" In the room, they begin to kiss. She has tiny breasts, and disrobing further, a tiny penis. Insignificant, yet he seems to find it inappropriate, and she hides her head in her hands, humiliated.
If she did not sleep this hour, I would not write. Are we as close in her sleep, as interdependent in my writing, as when I lift her to my shoulder, when I see milk seep from her mouth, as when I annoyingly lift her under the armpits above my head, as when I gaze back at her face, into her gaze from the new Anne Tardot's book, Lyn and Leslie kindly sent me? I think so. I would as soon say, I know so, but it sounds pretentious, and what good is that? I would probably be wrong by some light, or I might say yes and no. Now, since when? Since 40, 45? I think I know some things, and yet what I know fluctuates as radically and as reasonably as weather.
In the realm of desire, on the way to love, which is, whatever else, a name for the generosity of others, that is, for the disinterestedness of others, who cannot be otherwise, nor come to being except as other, to oneself certainly, but also to themselves, especially to themselves, if only and obliquely for themselves, and in that obliquity for others as well. One stops, it might be anywhere, for coffee, and there are no guarantees, for the pleasure of companionship, or at least the presence of others, strangers, call them, an assemblage of names that are not yet proper, that are not then or not yet known to oneself, poised as one is, at what will have become the memory of approaching a threshold.
In that seminar, the original model, as far as I am concerned, for all such seminars to come, the Utopian Reading Group, the Collective Talk Series, the Poetics Listserv in the Sky, we read the modern epic, beginning with Pound, Williams, Olson, and ending with Robert Grenier's A Day at the Beach, then a 2-volume tome, one short poem to a page, arguably as much the sunset of Western man as the Maximus poems. The seminar ended with the other graduate students rejecting my proposal that Grenier's A Day at the Beach continued the tradition of the modern epic, though Sherman Paul took the idea seriously and was solicitous of Grenier when he came through to give a well-publicized reading I organized later that spring. I remember from that event the self-canceling nature of Grenier's presentation, as well as the row of Iowa stalwarts sitting in back, Marvin Bell, Donald Justice, Roger Weingarten, and Norman Doobie, who snickered through the whole thing and thought Grenier had lost his mind.
No desire without objectification? We could say desire objectifies while love identifies with. This is not going to be a claim for the moral innocence of romantic love. Objectification and identification are conjoined twins. As Lacan points out, it's the objectified wholeness and competence of the other, parent, mirror image with which the child identifies. But while objectification and identification may grow from the same root, they are experienced differently. This is too obvious to elaborate, I suppose, but I wonder how we as friends and poets identify with and objectify one another. What troubles me is the way it gets more complicated still. People not only objectify the other, they objectify themselves for the other or for what they imagine the other to be. The way we want to see ourselves is hopelessly entangled with the way we want to show ourselves. This can be pretty disturbing, especially as the capitalist media participates by presenting the personality as commodity.
I revisit the above statement. I have always been opposed to the military in any form and wonder about the validity of the statement. Is this true in an emotional sense? Is this a statement of opposition? In the 1970s, the U.S. military was not held in high regard, and this was hard on personnel returning from Vietnam. Young men picked off by the draft and sent overseas to kill came back shells of themselves, then suffered further from the neglect of their government. One of these men was my cousin. The theme of love in poetry recollects all the above in my mind and has something to do with my then investigation of discordant sentences that, if at all romantic, were they, stayed on the playful and jarring side of romance. E. Wet, tidy embraces? I'm going to make up my own card game so I don't have to look at yours. Soothing words can be unsettling, you know.
One night in September 1971, two men in their early 20s sit at a kitchen table in a house on 25th Street in Noe Valley. They take turns typing on an Olympia manual typewriter. They stay up until around 3 a.m. They write 7 poems, The Concept of the Good. They hit on a common, but not a private, language that will continue to develop through correspondence, at first mostly postcards, later email, and a series of collaborations over the course of the next 30 years. One day in 1979, a man and a woman take turns on that same Olympia typewriter at a desk by a window on Cap Street in the Mission District. They write a short story, Tables. In order to create a seamless effect, the man tries to imitate the prose style of the woman. He experiences the encounter as a game on a field whose dimensions are continuously redefined by the players. The story, always on the point of unraveling into chaos, somehow manages to cohere in unpredictably hilarious ways. La littérature, ce n'est point que ta-ta, ta-ta-ta. Arthur Craven.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, I'd like to take questions now.
Never.
Yes, you back there.
You may have talked about this in the beginning, but I'm curious, how did you decide which sections of the books to read, and then how did you decide on the series of the composition altogether?
It's a score.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh,
The question is, how did you decide on the order of the reading?
And what to read.
And what to read, right?
It's a score, and this score has been developed through a number of different performances. This is the most elaborate version of it. It begins, so we decided to begin with a canon, and so everybody composed lines for the canon, and it was timed. So a lot of this has to do with timing. And then the next part of the score, we had each 2 minutes to read from any part of the text. Right? Solos? Yes.
Part 1 of the score is everything is taken from Grand Piano 10, the final volume, and part 2 is wide open and solo.
So these decisions were made. I mean, these are some examples. I can explain the whole thing if you'd like, but these are examples of somewhat arbitrary decisions that would make something cohere for us, rather than making it so open that we were kind of unguided in the decisions that we were making. So it's a score that has something to do with ideas that perhaps to some degree come from structured improvisation. Is that enough information for you?
I want to add something as well. This is not just a score. This is like a theory of interpretation. This is a way to read the work, and the way that we're putting together and recombining the text now is the way that we're not continuing to read the text. And making a public performance of it is a part of that.
And I would just add that the score was really difficult, and I had a lot of trouble with it. And as you were probably able to tell. I know what I actually wanted to say was that I don't write off unless anybody else objects at the table. See any reason why we couldn't just show you the score? It's up here, and anybody who wants to see it can come take a look at it. Yeah.
Or we'll put it online.
Or we'll put it online if you'd like.
It's freeware. You know.
Yeah.
And also, some of the sections are thematic, so we actually had to think about certain themes, like the theme of community, friendship, dissensus was one area of thematization, and then sometimes the volumes themselves thematize themselves, so we were all reading from the Grand Piano 1, and that particular volume had a very specific theme, which was the theme of love.
So the way that the reading is structured in some ways reflects the way that the text was written over a period of 10 or 12 years, in that there are arbitrary segments, there are decisions about the theme and content which the different participants often violated or handled interpretively in different ways from each other, and there are interactions between different people's work that occur in the course of composition.
Yes.
Technicality, I saw you guys all did your personal devices and go 1, 2, 3, push the button.
Yeah.
So what's that? They're all just stopwatches?
Yeah, everything, yeah.
Okay.
They're just
So
time.
entrances and exits are timed, and at the end of each movement, the bowl, if you go over or under, that's the end of the section.
I'm going to say that one of the great influences of this performance is something we talk about a lot in the Grand Piano, which is the performance that a number of us did of Zukowski's A24, which was really hard because you had to time language to musical musical measures, and it was the work of that, I think, that resonates with the interest in mapping language to arbitrarily chosen lengths of time that we're in the performance we're doing now. But the A24 stands, I think, behind our performance idea here, and it stands behind an idea of the collective voice, let's say, of the grand piano as well.
I would say that also certain kinds of practices in Poets Theater and the Rova saxophone quartet, which had a very strong idea about ensemble work and improvisation, is also behind these decisions.
You several times stepped on each other. Was that for style, or was that because you ran out of time?
Mostly time.
Yeah, we just entered at the exact moment, regardless of yeah.
You're entering on a mark. So someone has the option of running to the mark and you cut them off, or they may end a few seconds short and then you can come in after a brief silence. Yeah.
Hand back there in the red first, and then you in the gray. Yes, you. Yes.
Could you stand up?
What was the process whereby you put it all together, got everything in order? Do you all get together in a war room and just try things and just see if that works?
This performance?
Well, or this one or anyone, because it's not just random. Was this just random, or you didn't know what the next person was going to do?
No, we're using a score. So so we have a pattern of instruction. We have instructions, and then we all contribute text to those constructions. So each of us has pieces of paper that are responding to instructions from piece to piece. And so those instructions, which are the score, were sent out over the internet, and then we all came with our own script responding to those instructions, and then we rehearsed.
Okay, I just understood now what you meant before.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, if you think of a musical score, the conductor has a score with all the parts, and so that's provided. That schemata is provided to the pianists, And then each of them has to construct their own script faithful to the master score. Yeah.
But-
This brings up an important point. The grand piano was written via an online listserv, so we were physically separated from each other. And the same thing occurred in responding to the prompts for writing this piece. We didn't really rehearse it until this morning because physically we don't live in the same place. So the internet is, and the distribution of the work of composition is crucial to the whole project, and we keep on doing that because we have to.
And it's worth mentioning as well that in the case of this score, the score for tonight's performance and the one we're doing on Sunday, which if any of you want to come to will be totally different, was created by Ted and Carla.
And the dialogue section in the middle where it's two people going back and forth, that was done, we built those dialogues sort of, collaboratively.
Just over the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, by email.
Yes.
You in the gray? Actually, you in the gray first, and then woman in the red.
So as performers, did you learn or discover something new in tonight's performance that you didn't experience before?
It's all about the audience, right?
I'll tell you later. There's a lot of processing that has to happen to know.
Actually, I'd say one thing was that the timing of the performance this evening was absolutely more precise than we've ever done, and I didn't expect that to happen.
It's a great question. I would say absolutely. I mean, absolutely, there's plenty to learn by being physically in a room together and collaboratively handling a complex set of requirements like this. This is not something that we ordinarily get to do. One of the lines I didn't read was, because I didn't have time to read it, was something on the order of, I don't get to see my friends enough. And this is, I mean, it's been a fabulous experience. I hope I speak for all, or at least most of us, to do this via the net. But it's been, it's another kind of fabulous experience to get together and actually hear the way things resonate. I didn't, until we rehearsed this morning, know that I would hear something about a line of mine about objectification from Rae, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't know that either. And then actually, I said something about present, past, and future coexisting in physics that Kit said, and we didn't know that either. So there were, some parts were planned in terms of content, but most parts were only planned in terms of time. And so there were echoes that came up that, we hadn't anticipated. And, they're there in the book to see and to read, but it's different when you hear them in a compacted time.
And imagine this for an echo. I mentioned Josephine Miles, who I met on the floor above, actually. And she wrote the letter that got me into Iowa, and that was in 1969. So.
And she used to be the person who directed the Holloway series, under whose auspices this is taking place.
Josephine Miles is actually really an important figure for bringing poetry to Berkeley, particularly in the 50s and 60s. She was, Spicer's sort of patron, and there's a real history of poetry in the Berkeley English department that sort of is accessed through Josephine Miles, and it just so happens we happen to be here. So.
And another part of your question, actually, yes, after almost 40 years, we still surprise each other pretty regularly. Yeah.
My answer would be that some of us will learn what we found out tonight through this group reading when we listen to the recording.
Oh, yeah.
So I have actually you. There's a different person in the gray, and then we'll get to you, and then Brian. Okay.
I just wanted to ask if you've ever considered doing a reading in which one of you was the conductor, or like the sole score earner, or you know what I mean, the person in charge of the score, and so on and so forth.
Can you say more about why that would be of interest to you?
Because I think a lot of it, well, personally, I've seen that a lot in jazz music and seen it really, there's a lot of orchestras out there.
Like Butch Morris?
Yeah, Black February was the movie, I believe. I only know his name from the movie. But that sort of thing, where you sort of point at somebody and they do their lines and so on and so forth. I don't know, it's just kind
Well, how would we decide to do that? Say more later about it. I mean, it's an interesting question when you're thinking about something that's kind of been consistently equally distributed with such radically different kinds of content. What the logic of having one person conductor with each one. Sounds cool.
turn the format would suddenly become the focus. So no longer was it just about the content, but the form of each person standing would be the performance in itself. Suddenly.
Nice, thanks.
Well, one thing that suggests is, how do we edit this, right? Because usually, an author stands in relationship to an editor who then reads the work and comments on it. We all edited each other, which is very complicated. So all the text went out to all the authors, and all the authors, given goodwill and time, would send feedback to all the other authors, right? So this is incredible amount of meta comment went on in the composition of each volume. If you can imagine how many combinations there are of people responding to each other's work. And so then you would just, decide what feedback to incorporate in your final draft, right? But there never was a single editor, let's say, that sort of orchestrated the composition of the work. So it's kind of against the spirit of the way that the work was constructed, to think of it. But that doesn't mean you couldn't reinterpret it in that way. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying that there wasn't a single privileged position of any one of us in terms of making the work cohere or happen even. So.
How many emails were there, Barry?
Oh, we think about 20,000, I think, at this point, yeah. Probably.
One question?
Your question?
Rachel,
Your question in the red,
Rachel has had her hand up for a long time.
Okay. Okay.
You, Rachel.
I think it's this, okay. So it seems, I was thinking about kind of postpartum moment at the end of this kind of huge project of writing, but then this life that's so vibrant of the performance. And so is there a way that you, and sort of, in a way it's a how do you feel question, but it's also, might it then go from this writing, not in physical body thing to a performance in body for a while? Do you see that becoming a performance troupe of this?
That would be enormous fun, although it's very demanding, and we live all over the country. So the great probability is that won't happen. It won't happen very often. But this has been a really great experience that makes one want to have it happen. A kind of related question is, what do you do with something like the grand piano after you've completed it? When we started it, we thought of it as a written project, clearly, but it was also, I'll speak for myself, but I think for most people, it was also an opportunity to be in closer touch with people who mattered a lot to you and to whom you hoped, and to which you hope to add, as it were. And so that raises the question at the end of a project like this, what do you do? And to some degree, although in a kind of inchoate way, we've been talking about what else might one do with the grand piano if you thought of it, for example, as a platform rather than as a publication. And among other things, one thing you can do is you can engage with there's been a lot of response to the grand piano, some of it pointing to its limitations, which are obvious. It has obvious limitations. There's 10 people involved in the grand piano. There was never a world in which there was a hard stop at 10. And so if you talk about wanting to, in some sense, enact and make new a set of experiences, then how might you make that border more porous? How might you extend? And well, these are all opportunities that take that are, I would say, under discussion, and that, of course, in each case represent demands on time and so forth. So,
Brian.
Perfectly segueing what you just said, and to kind of bounce off of Jasper's introduction, riffing off the word collective. I'm curious, in what sense, in just a few words on this, because you definitely have to say, I'm sure everyone's read about it, like, does the collective of 10 people have in relation to the idea of community? So in a word, I guess the question is, in what sense is the Grand Piano a community project? Is it or isn't? I guess in what sense is it a community project, in what sense is it not? And the difference between collective and community for this project.
It's a great question, and there is a distinction to be made. As I recall, the subtitle is an experiment in collective, right? Autobiography. So collective is not a given or an assumption. It's rather part of the thought experiment over that period of years and thought and exchange, right? So collective remains an open and not unproblematic question. On the other hand, it's obviously collaborative, right? I mean, in the most literal possible sense. People are collaborating. Nothing particularly new there. Art and scholarship are both collaborative enterprises. But it's a great question because for myself solely, as I read tonight from excerpts, a community of practice, right, is a known term in social theory. Okay, so it has a certain specificity that presumably is capable or intends to address a larger community around it, not as a leadership role, but just as a collective experimental voice, a small community speaking to a larger community.
I think there's something about the freedom of the collective that is being explored in the work, and part of that freedom is that the collective is contingent on all kinds of circumstances, including the circumstances of the construction of the work, and that it could change or fail. And that without that possibility, the collective, it does not possess its own freedom, which is clearly what's happening right now, right? You know, the collective thing that's going on right now seems to be generated on its own structural understanding of its freedom, which is that it's contingent and it could change, alter, and even come undone, and it wouldn't lose its value. Exactly. And I think that's really something formally that we we're working out inherently, imminently, let's say, in the terms of the work.
I would say that community is what we built in the 70s, and that it was important to have a community in order to write what we wanted to write, and that by building a community, we were able to write those works and to do what we did. I think as content, at that period of time as content, enabled us to reconstitute the community, which by the past 10 years, there had been a diaspora, and each of us was involved in a different community or several different communities. So in a sense, we were reconstituting that community through the collective activity of creating the work.
I'd like to say also that I think many of us I can't speak for everybody, but I always saw myself as involved in diverse communities, a lot of which made contact, intermingled, and I couldn't, say precisely who or even what constitutes community in some kind of closed way, which I think and then I guess the other thing is that there's a lot of discussion or pointing to community in this work, and I think it's really, that discussion is really about the porousness of community and questions related to what describes and what defines community and how that works within the arts in a public sense as well. So I don't think that, anyway, I don't know if there's questions about boundaries that are sort of implied in what you're asking or not, but that's my question.
We probably have rolled this ball around long enough, but just really quickly, also, collective is a complicated word because it's used as an abstract noun. It's used as an adjective. As an abstract noun, it's a contested term in many, many, many ways. Where it's used, to collective farm, the forms of that make a unit exist in a way that don't exist, that don't, in a way completely different from how it works for us. We have a tendency to think that when we use terms that have social meaning that we've explained something, but I'm just going to sound like Bruno Latour here. If you haven't read him, please do. But actually, social terms only call on you to explain them. They don't really help you understand. On their own, they don't help you understand anything. Well, they don't. They just help you pass on to the next thing thinking that you've understood.
Would anybody like to add to that? Comment?
There was a question.
We'll get some.
Yeah.
In other words, there's a listening to and hearing of and seeing over time from the audience point of view, whatever context it's fun. And so going forward, I was curious to know how audience in the past and the present, even given tonight, and the future would in any way reflect the project.
Can you repeat the question? That was perfect.
Can you stand up and repeat the question again?
Oh, cut it out.
She wants to know how audience impacts and or inflects the project as community.
The work depends upon readers, it depends upon listeners when it's performed. And there, perhaps, at least for me, is an ongoing assumption that has some continuity over time, and that it moves, that it spreads like a body of water. It is not static.
And this idea of audience is somehow the receiver of the work, right? Let's call that into question and say, I can imagine a really optimal circumstance where, people reading the grand piano or listening to it would, extend it either interpretively or doing something parallel to it or inspired by it. So that's how I would want to rethink audience, actually. It's not just simply, sending something over to the audience and then having the audience hear it. And I can also imagine audiences refusing to do that.
Yeah,
and that goes back.
We in fact have some experience.
We
of
have
that
some
over
experience
a
of
long
that
period
too.
of time.
Yeah. So
But
nothing is taken for granted in that sense. And so the fact that we have this audience is really terrific, actually, and very moving to us.
But I'd like to say that it's not, it's not just a matter of congeniality, okay? I mean, it's not like inviting the audience to be an actor here. It's really requiring the audience to be an actor for the work to actually have the significance that it could have for some imagined audience. For the audience, right? I mean, we can't do that,
I want to return to the question of community. In the past, there were lots of communities of artists associated together. And I wonder, do you see yourselves as another one of those communities similar to those in the past, or do you think there's something different about this community vis-a-vis other artistic communities in the past?
in theory or in practice? Do you think, like, did you have an idea to do it differently? And did it work out that it's different? Or did you just see that, yeah, just like, you know, the surrealists and so on and so on and so on. We're another version of that. I wonder what you think of that.
I think that you can't easily answer that question, but in terms of this particular project, it fits into ideas that are related to doing things in groups in which there isn't one leader, and that negotiates with the relationship of individual people to collective practice. And that is not unique to what we're doing by any means. There's lots of different kinds of groups of people who have done that, some of them identified as movements and others not. And so this project to me, fits inside of those kinds of explorations. Doesn't entirely answer your question, but it makes a porous relationship to it, I think.
There's a little bit of your question that depends on the theory of the avant-garde, and that's a huge topic, right? But you remember in the text there was that moment where the French woman said, oh, aren't you doing what Tristan Tzar did, right? And the notion that you're just simply reproducing because you do similar formal experiments. And I would say that is not an interesting notion of derivation or tradition, or the tradition of the avant-garde. But something like this, having done this, imagine going back to any number of artistic communities. I'm thinking, okay, not only Dada, which is kind of the canonical avant-garde movement, the one that really defines the avant-garde. How about the Bauhaus? How about Black Mountain? How about performance art in the 60s? How about the Chinese avant-garde right now around Ai Weiwei? Look at each one of those configurations and understand something about how to read them through their differences, and that starts to be very interesting. And that's why I would say the idiosyncratic nature of our project, I think, is something to be highly valued, rather than simply cloning off of a previously existing model.
There's history. We're the boomers, first generation to grow up with TV, drugs, Vietnam War, population explosion. A lot of people graduated from school. There are lots of differences between our generation and the ones that came before, as there are many differences between our generation and the ones that came after. And we have lots of writing communities today here in the Bay Area. So I think each is affected by the historical moment in which it's formed.
The 8 of us who sit up here don't constitute a community, or the 11 of us who prepared and produced the grand piano books don't constitute a community in ourselves, though we may be taken as standing for a community. But such a community would be quite amorphous, quite changing over time, and quite impossible to define the limits of. Whether it includes 50 people or 1,000 people would be anybody's guess. But I would answer the question, if we were calling language poetry or us as standing for something that seemed to be definable in some sort of group orientation, and did we see it as singular or trying to do it differently, I don't think that there's any self-defined way that's true, but I do think that just as each individual does her or his best, as each community might do its best, and I think that each will be different, but I don't know how to define that.
Question over here.
I think the very coherence of this performance is something that has really struck me tonight, because I've been seeing this coherence now for 37 years. And it's one of the things that's drawn me to it, as I've always been interested in the nature of the coherence. I've written a bit about it, but the question is, what do you guys see beyond, that? of the nature of the coherence of the language itself and of the poetics itself.
Something about that, which is, I don't think that the language that you're looking at is just simply, signification. That it's a, yeah, well, I mean, it's not just strings of words, right? And it's basically signification plus a set of interpretive constructs. And one of the things that I really liked about this was the way that very diverse content could actually provide intersecting interpretive frames for each other, so that you started to hear, resonances, partial local coherences, as you would say. But it's that second order aspect of language that I think is really functioning and allows you to be as arbitrary as you want and still be in the ballpark of some kind of coherence. So.
Well, one of the features of coherence is to allow for tension and difference. So that, I think that is certainly characteristic of what we did tonight, and characteristic of the way if there is a poetic, the way our poetic sort of has existed and flourished.
And looking at the long-term, George, that you lay out, I mean, we're talking almost 40 years or something. Barry would like to forget that, for the record. But I'm reminded, I mean, your question is a good, difficult, but I'm thinking of someplace where Roland Barthes says that the pleasure of the text is the text's pleasure in the cohabitation of languages. And I think part of what we've been about for a very long time is finding ways for languages to cohabit in peaceable discourse.
Yeah, and I was thinking about affect, because part of the performance is, as I was performing, I was thinking about kinds of playfulness and challenge and idea rhymes, etc. And I think maybe part of the coherence that you hear is an affective coherence. Like among the many things language writing is, it isn't, for example, nostalgic melancholy. It can be that at moments, but as a sort of a project, it seems like kind of vigorous and pissy, and very playful, and yeah. And I wonder if what? Nudgy, yeah. Yeah.
Very nudgy.
As opposed to nudgy, which is what the police batons did. According to the AP reports, the police nudged some students.
I also think that there's, on the other side of difference, there is stealing, borrowing, reading. We read each other, we use each other's structures, forms, ideas. So like formal innovation becomes something that starts to circulate among writers in ways that can't be, assigned a kind of, individual brand in a sense, but interests everybody, and people take each other's ideas, formal ideas, and use them and work with them in different ways. And I think there's some discussion of that also in the text. And so that, I think, has something to do with coherence, is that there's reading and responsiveness and activation happening.
Maybe coherence is an effect of a context that's been constructed over time, just through interaction.
Right.
There's been so much interaction. We've all influenced each other and so on.
My response would be that in the work that I think of as common in this set of persons and writers, that to tear apart, to deconstruct is valued equally with building and constructing. To negate is of equal value as to assert. To violate is of equal value as to protect. One isn't valorized over another, but each is of equal stress and throughout the work. But I'm not sure I could say that's true for each and every writer, but I would say in general, and I would say that maybe for every writer, that nothing be taken for granted has been, I feel, an abiding principle that isn't necessarily stated by anybody but me.
That was definitely an element, a very challenging and sometimes unnerving element of the editorial process as we composed the grand piano. Each of us was composing first our individual contributions to each of the volumes, and then composing them collectively into something that was where the resonances could be more clearly heard. And being told, no, that idea is actually, it doesn't hold. It's not working. Like I got really into this a notion of object relations. And I got shot down heavily by like 5 of my, Lyn, you don't know what you're talking about. Read these books or change.
One thing that makes me think about is that, Norman, you mentioned the surrealists. I think that a much better comparison would be the community of English Romantic poets. I mean, there's plenty of differences too, but because of the wide variety of interests of the participants outside the making of verse, the living in a rapidly changing environment of knowledge, sort of rise of certain kinds of important kinds of science, and the participation of people like Sir Humphrey Davies, who was a poet and a chemist, and this is quite different from, in a way, from if you want to call surrealism one of the acanonical avant-garde group, then it's very different, or movement. It's very different from that, and because it didn't involve a single, however shared, theoretical elaboration. Rather, it really was deeply, I would use the word empirical, and maybe get some critique for that, but empirical in a good sense of empirical.
I want to put in a good word for communities that don't have names. Also, like all of you that hang out together and read together, write together, talk together, are communities, and you don't have to have an ism or a movement name attached to you.
I was wondering if any of you had been approached, or if you would be open to another group of 8 people not involved with the grand piano composition performing this score, per se. Sure. Would that be something that you would be interested in publishing, sort of like Nick Lau's work, where there's heavy instructions on how to read the text and when to read certain parts?
Rob Fitterman did a video where he dramatized some of the grand piano with his daughter, and it was hysterically funny. And she was speaking the lines, some of which were the most Latinate and sort of portentously, grammatically elaborate of the text, and you had this 9-year-old sort of speaking. She's in a supermarket, she's doing commodity critique,
Yeah, it was pretty great.
So yeah, reinterpretation would be fantastic, like, and yeah.
Like as an installation of poetic kind of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure, yeah.
It could even include changing all of the words.
Overwriting it completely.
I think this has been asked in a number of different ways, but I just wanted to ask it maybe from another angle. I saw this, you performed this last year, and it's interesting in our season of Occupy how some different kinds of questions come to my mind. I know a lot of people have been hanging out at GAs and so forth, and the kind of intense debates and riffs. I just wonder if in this process, maybe very early on, what the closest thing to someone really having a position of dissent or a rift was, and what the process was. I mean, I hear you definitely say there's a baseline of respect, there's shared history, But it's interesting that you never had to come to the point of like a vote or something, you know.
Now, you read the text carefully, you'll find some real tension, some real tension in there.
You saw it tonight with Ray's, and Steve has a point here. You know, there's a lot. The tension is very clear, and I just wonder how was that surmounted?
We had to vote on how to set the tables up here.
You should have seen it.
Was it a vote? I thought we fought.
I was about to leave.
We did end up voting, I think.
Yeah, but the way the tables were set up, it does not correspond to how the vote came out. So,
on your account,
voting is an incomplete way to arrive at the best result.
But yeah, I mean that has something to do with the further history of the grand piano. You'll find out later what the real story was. You know, you'll just have to dig a while.
Well, I think one thing to say is that from looking, observing us up here performing, you might conclude that in using the word in a serious way that all of us or most of us most of the time love each other. And that you would be actually right, but you would not necessarily be right that we all get along, either all the time, most of the time, or that there's any time when all of us get along.
I would say also that when some kind of real conflict did, come, when a push came to a shove, there has always been a strong encouragement and reinforcement, whether on an individual or a group level, to stay in the game. However clear or unclear the rules of the game are, there is a game, and that all wanted to encourage each other not to get out of it. That mattered.
So nice of you all to come out tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.